Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Public Service Commission of South Carolina. We're here in docket number 2021-88E. Let's take roll. Present in the hearing room, we have Commissioners Caston Powers, Thomas Williams, Vice Chair Belzer, Chairman Williams, and joining us virtually, we have Commissioner Urban. Yesterday, before we took our evening recess, we finished with witness Cersei, and now it appears we're at Carolina Clean Energy Business Association's witnesses. Is Mr. Burgess or Mr. Levitas ready to testify?
I believe Mr. Burgess is.
All right. Attorney Burns, you seem to have a little bit of an echo on your microphone.
I haven't changed a thing about my setup. Is that better?
It just has that public address announcer feel here in the hearing room, but the live stream directors have not, or producers have not, waved me down, so maybe they can address it as you start your presentation.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. All I've got is the mic on my computer, and I haven't changed it. But I'll do what I can do if somebody might want to help me during a break and get that fixed.
Okay, sounds good. We'll try to drive through it.
Right.
Mr. Burgess, if you would take the witness stand and pause to be sworn in by the court reporter.
Would you please raise your right hand?
Madam Court Reporter, if you would speak into that microphone.
Would you please raise your right hand?
She's very, very, very quiet, sir.
It appears to be on. Yeah.
Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you'll give in this matter will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Burgess.
Good morning.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Please introduce yourself to the commission and state your name and business address.
My name is Edward Burgess, and my business address is 2150 Alston Way, Berkeley, California.
By whom are you employed and in what capacity?
I am a senior director at Strategy Consulting.
And what do you do as a senior director?
As a senior director, I manage and oversee our utility business consulting practice and work on a variety of projects around the country with public and private sector clients in the energy industry.
Could you provide the commission with a summary of your education and background?
I have a Bachelor of Arts in Chemistry from Princeton University and a professional science master's degree in solar energy engineering and commercialization from Arizona State University, and a master's of science in sustainability from Arizona State as well. I have substantial experience and oversee much of Strategy's utility-focused practice, as I mentioned, and working with private sector clients, and non-governmental organizations, and trade associations. My full experience is detailed in my direct testimony in my resume that's attached as Exhibit A to my direct testimony.
Did you prepare or cause to be prepared in this docket direct testimony consisting of 34 pages?
Yes, I did.
Do you have any changes or corrections to that testimony today?
Not at this time.
If I asked you the questions in your direct testimony today, would your answers be the same?
They would.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move Mr. Burgess's direct testimony into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Mr. Burgess's direct testimony will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Mr. Burgess, did you also prepare Exhibits A and B to your direct testimony?
Yes, I did.
Do you have any changes or corrections to make to those exhibits?
No.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move Mr. Burgess's Exhibits A and B from his direct testimony into the record as the next composite hearing exhibit.
Burgess Exhibits A and B will be marked as a composite exhibit and entered into the record as hearing Exhibit 10.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Burgess, did you prepare or cause to be prepared in this docket sir rebuttal testimony consisting of 31 pages?
Yes, I did.
Do you have any changes or corrections to your sir rebuttal testimony?
No, with the caveat that the sir rebuttal was responsive to Mr. David's original testimony, not the corrected testimony.
If I asked you the questions in your sir rebuttal testimony today, would your answers be the same as pre-filed?
Yes, they would.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move Mr. Burgess's sir rebuttal testimony into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Mr. Burgess's sir rebuttal testimony will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Burgess, did you prepare a summary of your direct and sir rebuttal testimony?
Yes, I have.
Please present your summary to the commission.
Thank you. My summary is as follows. In my opening testimony and sir rebuttal testimony, I review Dominion's proposal to increase the current variable integration cost, or VIC charge, to qualifying facilities by 88% for the majority of solar facilities with existing contracts, a group of facilities known as Tranche 1. Also to increase the VIC by 257% for new solar facilities going forward, facilities known as Tranches 2 and 3. I explain why the analysis supporting Dominion's proposed VIC is fundamentally flawed and make recommendations for how integration costs attributed to solar QFs should be assessed going forward. My key findings can be summarized as follows. To start, Dominion's supporting analysis is based on hypothetical and inflated integration costs that have no basis in how Dominion currently operates its system or plans to in the future. In fact, in its rebuttal, Dominion witness David and Bell admitted that the study used to determine the VIC is merely a set of recommendations that the company is still evaluating. Additionally, the proposed VIC is entirely premised on Dominion's stated need to increase the level of operating reserves it maintains on its system in anticipation of a sudden and unexpected drop in solar output. However, an examination of the historical levels of operating reserves that Dominion has maintained on its system in recent years shows that they have not increased, even as nearly all of the Tranche 1 solar facilities have been deployed. Additionally, the historical level of reserves already far exceeds what the company says it needs to integrate solar Tranches 1, 2, and 3. These reserve levels are shown in Table 1 on page 15 of my direct testimony. Thus, any increase in integration costs for solar deployed in the recent past or near future is likely close to zero. While Dominion's operating practices are undoubtedly evolving due to solar, testimony from one of Dominion's system operators, Mr. Hanslick, does not identify any specific new costs associated with this evolution. Instead, Dominion justifies its VIC increase with claims about the variability of solar requiring substantial new operating reserves, which, as discussed above, is not consistent with their past performance. Even if one were to accept Dominion's faulty premise that additional cost recovery is urgently needed to support an increase in solar-related operating reserves, the supporting analysis the company uses is inadequate in many respects. For instance, as in 2019, Dominion continues to avoid using a transparent methodology informed by stakeholder feedback for determining its integration costs. Instead, Dominion has taken a black box approach to its analysis and has not revealed the crucial algorithms it used to calculate the operating reserve requirements used in its modeling. While some of the initial data sets Dominion used were eventually provided through discovery, the company has still not revealed exactly how that data was processed, such that I can verify if it was done correctly. There was a small number of illustrative examples where Dominion did provide an algorithm that included incorrect formulas that would have skewed the integration costs significantly higher. And as I'm reading this summary now, I should note that the previous sentence I just stated may need to be amended in light of Mr. David's corrections from Friday. Dominion's analysis in this case also suffers from many of the same deficiencies identified in the 2019 proceeding, which it has failed to correct. For instance, they have not improved the forecast time horizon, not allowed for intra-hour dispatch improvements, not modeled pump storage correctly, not weighted reserves based on actual solar output, and not proven a proper accounting for geographic diversity. Dominion also introduces new errors that I describe in my testimony. Correcting for just 3 of these deficiencies would result in a 26 to 71% decrease in the VIC from the present interim level, rather than the proposed 88 to 257% increase. Correcting other errors would reduce the VIC even further. For QF developers, the uncertainty associated with the interim nature of the VIC and the possible true-up has caused significant challenges for solar project developers in terms of obtaining financing. And finally, Dominion's proposed mitigation protocol is highly flawed and appears designed to ensure the maximum VIC is charged to solar facilities rather than encourage behavior that would actually mitigate Dominion's integration costs. Based on these findings, I suggest that the Commission adopt the following recommendations. First, the Commission should reject Dominion's proposal to increase the VIC for facilities in both Tranche 1 and Tranche 2 and above, since such an increase is unsupported by the evidence the company presented. A final fixed VIC should also be adopted in this proceeding, and any changes to the VIC in subsequent proceedings should not apply to PPAs subject to the final fixed VIC adopted in this proceeding. Given the lack of incremental operating reserve needs beyond historical levels, a VIC charge of $0 per megawatt hour is appropriate at this time. This is consistent with the lack of any observed reserve shortfall in Dominion's analysis of Tranche 1 without reserves, when certain errors are corrected. If the Commission feels compelled to adopt a non-zero VIC in this proceeding as a safeguard to ratepayers, the Commission should consider the values of 28 cents per megawatt hour or less for Tranche 1 and 71 cents per megawatt hour or less for Tranche 2 and above. This corrects for some of the deficiencies in Dominion's VIC analysis. Establishing a final VIC at these levels is more reasonable than what Dominion has proposed and would provide cost transparency and certainty to QF developers while protecting ratepayers from overpayment, even if these values do not address all of the deficiencies in the company's analysis. Any future integration cost studies, including studies for what Dominion calls Tranche 3, should follow the stakeholder process outlined in South Carolina Statute Section 58-37-60A. And finally, the mitigation protocol proposed by Dominion should be rejected, and the Commission should require the company to adopt a protocol more similar to the one it already has developed for North Carolina. That protocol is different from the one proposed by Dominion here in the following respects. First, it measures the change in output relative to an expected forecast rather than the prior hour. Second, it measures hourly variability in terms of total megawatts rather than a skewed percentage-based method. And third, it captures the totality of performance over time rather than singling out 1 hour each month. This protocol should also be updated to include key improvements I described in my testimony. This concludes my summary. I'm sorry, Mr. Burns, I can't hear you.
I muted my sketchy microphone. Sorry about that. Thank you, Mr. Burgess. Did you have an opportunity to listen to the testimony of witness Hanslick this week?
Yes.
Since that testimony, have you had a chance to review the composite exhibit that he and his attorneys provided after the hearing on last Tuesday evening?
Yes.
In response to that exhibit and the testimony about it, have you had a chance to prepare any further surrebuttal testimony?
Yes.
Are you prepared to submit that supplemental rebuttal testimony in the form of a brief Q&A with me?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, we respectfully request that the supplemental rebuttal testimony of Mr. Burgess be accepted in the form of a brief Q&A.
Mr. Burgess's supplemental testimony will be accepted.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Burgess, I'm going to refer you to the composite exhibit that was filed in support of Mr. Hanslick's testimony. I want to make sure that I'm sharing the right screen. Are you looking at a graph of August 13th, 2021?
I can see it.
Is that visible in the commission's room, Mr. Chairman?
It is, sir. If you could afford to enlarge it a bit more, it would be helpful for us.
I'll do my best. Mr. Hanslick, Mr. Burgess, I'm referring you to Mr. Hanslick's composite exhibit and the graph related to August 13th, 2021. Mr. Hanslick described the drop that occurred on this day as a 48% drop. Is that correct?
Yes, that's what I believe I heard him say.
From a VIC perspective, would you agree that this chart shows a 48% drop?
No, well, I agree that the low points of about 403 megawatts occurring at 3:44 p.m. is about 48% less than the high point of 778 megawatts occurring at 10:01 a.m. This drop occurs over almost 6 hours, giving Dominion time to respond by identifying and committing additional operating reserves if necessary. According to Dominion's methodology for calculating the VIC, the relevant drops are calculated on a 15-minute increment. Dominion's rationale for this is that the NERC Reliability-Based Control Standard, or BAL 001-2, require utilities to balance their generation and load on a 30-minute average. To be conservative, the VIC study assumes that any operating reserve shortfall be corrected on a 15-minute basis. Thus, the relevant time frame to consider any variable integration costs, as Dominion has defined it, is 15 minutes, not 6 hours.
Can you explain why the difference in the 15-minute and 6-hour timeframes matters?
Yes, while some of Dominion's generation units, like coal, take longer to turn on and might take even more than 6 hours, Dominion has many units that can respond very quickly and in less than 6 hours. This includes about 400 megawatts of quick start gas turbines and 576 megawatts of fast acting pump storage. Because these are fast acting units, they do not necessarily need to be turned on ahead of time and thus do not incur any costs to be made available for responding to unexpected drops. As Mr. Hanslick explained, Dominion's control room operators are constantly monitoring system conditions in real time, 24/7, to respond to events as they arise. Thus, while they have options to respond quickly over a 15-minute period, the system operators would have even more options to respond over a 6-hour time period. 6 hours may even be long enough for slower acting units, like combined cycle plants, to respond in a meaningful way.
Of the 6 days that Dominion shows on its composite exhibit, which one has the most significant 15-minute drop in solar production?
August 17th shows a drop of about 251 megawatts occurring around 3:30 p.m. I presume this is related to the predictable tropical storm weather that others have previously described.
When you refer to August 17th, is that the graph currently on the screen before you?
Yes, that appears to be so.
Do you know if Dominion had forecasted a drop in solar production around 3:30 p.m. on August 17th?
No, since the forecast data was not provided, I have no way of knowing how the actual production compares to the expected production. The forecast data would be needed to demonstrate how much of this drop was unexpected. Keep in mind that the VIC only accounts for unpredicted drops, not forecasted drops, and that is a crucial distinction. I would expect that Dominion forecasted a lower level of production, even if not exact, around the time period of the drop due to the weather predictions known in advance.
How does a 251 megawatt drop compare to the operating reserves that Guidehouse assumed in its VIC analysis for August?
It is significantly lower. In the Guidehouse study, the operating reserves assumed to be required to account for solar drops was 557 megawatts for Tranche 1, as shown in Table 11 of the study. So Guidehouse is excessively inflating the amount of operating reserves needed for solar, which is a key driver of integration costs, to more than double what would actually be required on this particular day. Since Guidehouse applies this 557 megawatt assumption to all hours within the month in ProMod, It substantially increases the integration costs in its study relative to what is realistically required, even on an extreme day like August 17th.
Do you believe a 251 megawatt drop is significant enough for Dominion to increase its operating reserves, which is the basis of the VIC analysis, in any meaningful way relative to how it has operated its system in recent years?
No, based on the data I reviewed from Dominion's discovery responses, the operating reserves it held in the 2016 to 2017 time period, even before solar QFs were added, were over 1,000 megawatts on average. This is just the natural outcome of how Dominion has economically dispatched its system, and means that the system has a lot of headroom to absorb solar at little or no cost before new operating reserves become necessary. In fact, based on my analysis of Dominion's data, the instances in 2016 to 2017 where operating reserves were less than 251 megawatts occurred less than 0.01% of the time.
What about now, after over 800 megawatts of solar has been added to Dominion's system?
Based on my review of Dominion's data in the 2020 to 21 timeframe, with over 800 megawatts on the system, there were 0 instances where operating reserves were less than 251 megawatts. Even if one were to take an overly conservative approach that doubled the level of required reserves to 502 megawatts, I found that Dominion's actual operating reserves in the 2020 to 21 timeframe only fell below that level less than 0.4% of the time that solar was operating. So even if Dominion took a more conservative approach than what was used today, it might need to increase operating reserves in less than 1% of hours. Thus, the need to significantly increase operating reserves during all solar production hours, that is 100%, as a Guidehouse study recommends, is clearly incorrect, and thus its VIC analysis is fundamentally flawed.
The data shown in these charts provided by Mr. Hanslick has a resolution of 1 minute, correct?
Yes, you can see that on the chart currently shown and how squiggly the lines are.
Mr. Hanslick described this chart as a realistic picture of what he and his team must respond to in the Dominion control room by ensuring that there are enough operating reserves to deal with this variability. Do you agree?
Yes.
Did you hear Mr. Hanslick talk about the fact that the operating reserves are being consistently updated in real time over the course of the day?
Yes, that's my understanding.
And would this minute-by-minute view provide a more meaningful picture of what his team has to deal with than a monthly average value would provide?
Yes.
Does the need to analyze the system on a minute-by-minute view, such as what Mr. Hanslick provided in his charts, invalidate a monthly average view, such as what you provided in Table 1 of your direct testimony?
No. As I recall, Mr. Hanslick criticized the monthly average tables I provided as meaningless from a system operator's perspective. Actually, I agree that those monthly values do not provide precise insight into what a system operator must deal with on a minute-by-minute basis, as reflected in the charts he provided. However, I simply used the average values to summarize what was going on during each minute of the data provided over the course of an entire year. It would not have been practical for me to provide a table with over 500,000 data points for the entire year. So an average value seems like a good way to illustrate the basic concept. That said, a closer look at the distribution of those underlying data points tells the same story. The operating reserves held by Dominion at virtually all 1 minute increments over the last year have far exceeded its minimum requirements, even after accounting for what it holds for solar drops and other contingencies. I'd be happy to provide additional information explaining this point.
Thank you, Mr. Burgess. Does that conclude your comments on Mr. Hanslick's composite exhibit?
Yes.
Did you hear the corrections that witness David made from the witness stand on Friday, August 20th?
Yes.
Can you briefly summarize those changes as you understand them?
Yes, on Friday, Mr. David made several substantive changes to his testimony from the witness stand. He prefaced these changes as being only 3 minor corrections all on the same topic. Indeed, the first 3 corrections he made, some of which were multi-part corrections, all related to the issue of hourly weighting of the VIC to solar production. Specifically, witness David modified his original testimony and study to remove claims that he had used hourly weighting in calculating the VIC charge. While these are significant modifications to Mr. David's testimony, they were changes that I could have anticipated since I had identified the mismatch between Mr. David's original testimony claiming to use hourly weighting and his subsequent testimony in which he said that he abandoned that approach. It remains my position that hourly weighting is more accurately captures the impact of solar forecast error on Dominion's system.
Were those all the changes that Mr. David made?
No, there was actually a 4th change, and in many ways a much more significant change that Mr. David made to his testimony, specifically his rebuttal. His change replaced the reference to one set of work papers Dominion had provided in June, namely the Guidehouse VIC calculation workbook, which was part of Dominion's supplemental response to ORS 1-4, and changed it to an entirely different set of work papers that Dominion produced in July in response to CCBA 2-14.
What exactly is in CCBA 2-14, and why is it problematic for the change to have been made that way?
There are 6 different spreadsheets attached to Dominion's discovery produced in response to CCBA data request 2-14 versus only 2 that were included in the originally referenced Guidehouse VIC calculation workbook produced in response to ORS 1-4. The 6 spreadsheets produced in response to CCBA 2-14 contain detailed results for each time step of the ProMod runs conducted for the VIC analysis and include crucial data such as the estimated hourly megawatts of reserve shortage and contribution to operating reserves for each generation unit. These data were not included in the spreadsheet Mr. David originally referenced as having relied upon and which was produced in response to ORS request 1-4.
What conclusion is the new reference to CCBA 2-14 going to support or set to support?
Mr. David states in his corrected testimony that these work papers show both that one, DESC is carrying operating reserves in excess of 250 megawatts during most hours, and crucially, that there are a relatively small number of hours when the company does not have excess operating reserves in the base case, that is without increased operating reserves. This shortage of reserves in a small number of hours is the underlying driver for the costs to integrate each tranche of solar. That is, it underpins the fundamental basis for establishing the VIC charge at any level.
Would your rebuttal have been different if the updated reference to CCBA 2-14 had been included by Mr. David in his original testimony?
Yes, based on Dominion's original testimony, my analysis to date demonstrated that Mr. David's testimony provided no basis for the additional operating reserves said to be required by Tranche 1 solar production. Mr. David's reference to a new set of data requires me to update my analysis in rebuttal.
Do you have a preliminary view on whether Mr. David's changed reference for the basis of his testimony would change your conclusions?
Yes, for example, Mr. David now seems to be claiming that this newly cited spreadsheet, that is CCBA 2-14, proves that there is a need to increase available operating reserves in the relatively small number of hours in which the company does not carry an excess in the baseline scenario. But the spreadsheets produced in response to CCBA 2-14 appear to have at least 3 methodological errors. First, they do not properly account for geographic diversity. Second, they seem to undercount the contribution of the 576 megawatt Fairfield pump storage project to operating reserves. And third, they appear to assume an operating reserve requirement for solar that is far above Dominion's actual operating practice in onboarding nearly 900 megawatts of solar. But those are only preliminary concerns. The spreadsheets produced in response to CCBA 2-14 were originally downplayed in Dominion's rebuttal as just concerning illustrative examples. Now it is clear that this information is near the core of Mr. David's still obscure analysis. Additional discovery is needed to fully understand the accuracy, completeness, and significance of this information and how it was used in Mr. David's creation of the VIC.
Mr. Burgess, have you concluded your supplemental rebuttal testimony?
Yes, I have.
Mr. Chairman, we now tender Mr. Burgess for questions from Dominion and from other interveners and the commission.
All right. Do interveners have questions for this witness?
No questions from Pine Gate. This is Bland Holman with Pine Gate. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, this is Kate Mixon with SACE and CCL. We don't have any questions for Mr. Burgess either.
No questions from the Department of Consumer Affairs.
Mr. Chairman, same for Johnson Development. No questions.
All right. Applicant.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Burgess. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. I imagine it's a little early where you are this morning, isn't it?
Yeah, the sun is still on its way up, so.
Well, it'll be nice and quiet. You won't have any disturbances out on the street yet. Let me start with some preliminary questions, Mr. Burgess. When were you retained to work on behalf of CCBA in this case?
It was in the around the June timeframe.
Could it have been as late as early July?
It may have been. We may have finalized the agreement in early July. Yes.
Do you actually have an engagement agreement?
With CCBA?
Yes.
We have an agreement to provide testimony on behalf of CCBA.
Would you look at that engagement agreement and tell me what date is on that agreement?
I believe it was confirmed on around July 1st.
That's July 1 of 2021, correct?
Correct.
And are you paid for your services in this case?
Yes.
And are you paid by the hour?
In this, yeah, I have an hourly rate in this case. Yes.
Do you have a incentive where you get paid depending upon the outcome of the case?
No.
You testified, I believe, in 2019. Is that correct?
I did.
And when I'm going to just use it generally, 2019, I meant you testified in the avoided cost proceeding that the commission held in 2019. And you did testify in that case, correct?
Yes.
And who did you work with, or who were you working for in that case?
In that case, I was working with the South Carolina Solar Business Alliance.
And were you, you did, your clients did very well in that case in terms of you recommending, and we're going to look at an order here in a minute, you recommending an interim VIC at a 96 cents level, which is ultimately what the commission did, and you're mentioned prominently in the order. Were you provided any incentive or bonus as a result of the work that you did in that case?
No.
So you were paid purely by the number of hours that you put in the case?
Yeah, that's right.
Do you ever work, and are you working in this case, on a flat fee plus an additional amount if your hours go beyond a certain level?
I think in both cases, generally the arrangement is a certain budget not to exceed with an hourly rate, and then if we exceed that budget, then I'll have a conversation with the client about it.
So it's a flat fee up to a certain amount of hours. What is that flat fee in this case?
I believe that's confidential with my client.
I don't believe it is. You've been tendered as an expert. So I asked you again, what is that flat fee in this case?
In this case, I'd have to go back and double check my records on the exact amount. I don't have it off the top of my head.
What is your best recollection?
I would guess it's probably in the $30,000 range.
I'll ask you to check when we have a break, but thank you for that estimate at this time. And you're testifying in this proceeding on behalf of the Carolinas Clean Energy Business Association. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you are aware that the members of that association are all solar developers, correct?
I don't know if they're all solar developers, but I know that there are solar developers that are members.
Would you think that the large, vast majority of the membership would be solar developers?
That seems reasonable to me.
And is it your understanding that solar developers are always seeking to invest capital in which they get a return on that capital, correct?
That's right.
And have you heard and know that most of the time the returns that they are expecting is in the range of 30% or greater?
I don't have any knowledge of what the exact returns would be. And that would seem high to me, to be honest.
Well, have you ever testified regarding banking issues or finance issues in which you're trying to justify either venture capital or lending for the finance of a project?
That's not my specific area of expertise, but I've testified generally on, some financial issues from time to time.
And aren't you aware from your work in those financial issues that venture capitalists who are behind many of these projects have a threshold for their returns that would be 30% or greater would be a target? Aren't you aware of that?
Mr. Chairman, I'd object to that. That's been asked and answered. Mr. Burgess already said that he wasn't aware of the terms of solar projects on that level.
I can.
Mr. Burgess?
Hold on, Mr. Burgess. We have an objection. Let's let the chairman rule, please.
Attorney Willoughby, do you have a response?
Yes, the question I asked was a little different question, and the witness, I believe, would be entitled to answer it.
All right. Could you state the question again? It sounded like the same question to me, but maybe I missed something. Could you state the question again?
From your work, you just mentioned that you have done some work on behalf of entities seeking financing. You did qualify it to say it was limited, but that you had done some work. Aren't you aware from that work, which is different than my previous question, which was more general, that the investment return that a venture capitalist or other investor in solar projects are looking for is in the range of 30% return to finance their projects?
Attorney Burns, I do think that's a bit of a different question. It sounds like Attorney Willoughby is trying to lay some breadcrumbs. Do you think that's the same question? Attorney Burns, do you think that's the same question?
I think it calls on the same base of knowledge, which my client is, my witness has already said he doesn't have, but, so
I
I'd
understand.
restate the objection.
The objection is overruled. Please continue, Attorney Willoughby.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Do you recall the question, Mr. Burgess?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would respond that, you know, in my experience in talking with independent, you know, power producers, which, you know, would be similar to, you know, solar developers. I mean, the range of returns that they generally are seeking is more in the 8 to 10% range, not 30%. That seems really high.
And who are you talking with that you work for that was seeking an 8 to 10% return?
These would be, like I said, independent power producers. So not vertically integrated utilities, but developers seeking to develop generation projects to sell into competitive markets or through power purchase agreements.
Were they solar developers?
Some were, I think, developing solar projects, but they're more general, you know, sort of IPP kind of entities.
So they were not purely solar developers, correct?
I guess that's probably true.
Well, based on your general knowledge within the industry, and you've participated in this industry for how many years now?
For about a decade.
So you've read and studied about the motivations and incentives that are being provided to solar developers to advance projects, have you not?
Yes.
And isn't it from that reading that you have discerned that using a combination of tax credits and other government incentives, plus the direct returns that solar developers get for selling their power, that they're typically looking at returns around the 30% range?
I'm going to restate my objection, Mr. Chairman. That's the third time now with slightly different words that he's asked the same question.
Sustained.
Mr. Burgess, you complain about, really you complain about everything, but I'm going to try to see if I can't talk about some of the things that you complained about. You complained about discovery. Did you review all of the discovery responses that Dominion Energy South Carolina provided in this case?
I believe I reviewed most of them. I don't know if I reviewed every single one, since some of them were some sort of repetitive, referring to other responses.
Well, in fact, one of the things that your client sought was for us to provide them all of the discovery we had provided to ORS and to all other parties. Isn't that one of the requests that SECIBA had?
Yes.
And the company did that, did they not?
Yes.
And let me go back to your date of employment. So you were employed on July 1. The initial testimony that SECIBA was supposed to file was on July 13. Were you in any position to provide testimony on July 13?
Well, at that point, we were prepared. We were planning to provide testimony on July 13th. It was a really short time frame because we didn't get Dominion's testimony until I think it was June 29th. So, you know, we recognized that there was a very narrow, you know, time period to work within. And plus at that point, you know, we hadn't received all of the discovery responses from Dominion. In fact, if I recall correctly, the second round came in it would have been a couple days after July 13th. So we wouldn't have had all the information really we needed to provide that testimony on July 13th. But luckily the commission, at the last minute granted an extension for us that allowed us to have an opportunity to review that second round of discovery from Dominion. So that gave us a better opportunity to more fully analyze some of the data, that we requested.
So, and the truth of the matter isn't it, Mr. Burgess, is that a no discovery request or even initiated by FIBA until early July. Isn't that correct?
I would have to double check, but that may be the case. I think there were other I know that they had issued discovery responses earlier than that too, I think, but I don't know. Yeah, I have to check.
Were you involved in preparation of those discovery requests?
Yes.
And so you work with counsel to tell the counsel what data you would like to have, correct?
That's correct.
And so you received all of the data that the company had previously provided to ORS and others. And then you had, I think, some additional questions that CECIBA asked that the time to respond to those requests would have been well after July 13. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, although I don't know why they couldn't have been provided sooner, because I think some of that data would have been available, as early as April when the application was filed.
But the first thing you did was ask for basically all of the discovery that was provided to ORS and other parties, and Dominion Energy promptly provided that information long before the time period that it would have been due, did they not?
Can you repeat that question?
Sure. So one of the requests that you had was give us all of the data that you provided to other parties, including ORS, which is fairly routine, and that was a request that CECIBA made, correct?
Yes.
And the company provided responses to those discovery requests by giving you all of the data that had been previously provided to other parties, including ORS, well in advance from the date that it would have been due under the rules, did they not?
Well, I think that those responses that were already made to other parties would have been provided sooner.
And so you had that data, you would have had that data maybe just a little bit before the testimony was due originally on July 13. So you had that to begin to review. And then you had additional discovery requests, one of which you've mentioned in response to some information about Mr. David's correction. You've mentioned CECIBA 1-4. Did I have that number correct, Mr. Burgess?
Is there a specific part of my testimony you're referring to?
Well, I think you make reference in your rebuttal, and you may have made reference into the supplemental testimony that the workbooks that Mr. David made reference to, he made reference to some workbooks that had been provided to ORS, and then he made reference to some workbooks, these are data workbooks, that he provided in response to CECIBA. Do you remember your testimony on those points?
Yeah, I think you'd have to be more specific about where, because I referenced each of those in multiple places in my testimony.
Correct. And one of the ways that you referenced it, you mentioned and I think your lawyers mentioned that the reason you wanted to be able to provide some supplemental testimony was because Mr. David made a reference to ORS discovery responses and workbooks that were mentioned there. Whereas he should have made reference to workbooks provided in response to SECIVA. Isn't that correct?
That's one thing I talked about earlier, yes.
And you criticized Mr. David for having to make a correction to make that correction, did you not?
Yeah, it was an entirely different piece of analysis that he referred to in his correction versus the original. And, you know, in that context, I had no way to sort of know that he had some other spreadsheet in mind, and it really changed the whole sort of purpose of that portion of his testimony and my understanding of it.
But you knew, did you not, that that let's take a look at your rebuttal here. But let me ask this question first. That you knew from just your review of Mr. David's rebuttal testimony that he had made an inadvertent reference to the wrong workbooks, didn't you?
No, I when I first reviewed his rebuttal, I figured he would have checked all those references to make sure they were correct. And so it was very confusing to me because the reference he included in that section, you know, he talked about data that wasn't actually in the spreadsheet that he referred to. And that was what I, you know, critiqued in my original rebuttal. But then I later, you know, after the correction on Friday, I found out he meant to refer to a different spreadsheet, which, again, as I mentioned, completely changes sort of my understanding of that part of his testimony.
Well, let's see, Mr. Burgess, if I can do well and keep myself in the running for this technology award here. I want to try to share my screen. Do you see what's on the screen?
Yes.
So this is your rebuttal testimony that was filed on last Monday, I believe, the 16th. Is that correct?
That's my recollection.
Yeah. So let's look at and Mr. Chairman, obviously, the commission, we're all taught as lawyers to make sure your decision maker is able to see the documents that you're making reference to. Can you and other members of the commission see my screen?
Perfectly. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And do note that I know Mr. Burns and Commissioner Belcher are now vying for this technology award, but I want you to make sure you're keeping tabs because I think I'm still slightly in the lead there, Mr. Chairman. Let's see if I can continue to hold that lead. So let me direct your attention to page 9, the question on the bottom, and I'm going to read this question. Mr. David's rebuttal on pages 9 and 10 refers to your interpretation of specific Excel files that DESC has provided regarding its SIC calculations. Specifically, he states that in these work papers, Guidehouse's analysis shows DESC carrying available operating reserves in significant excess of the baseline 250 megawatt requirements in most hours. How do you respond? Did I read that question correctly?
Yes.
And you respond by saying, Mr. David's rebuttal makes no sense to me. The specific Excel files he references, i.e., the Guidehouse VIC calculation workbook Excel files, do not contain any information about the amount of operating reserves, i.e., MW or megawatts, that were included in Guidehouse's analysis or how they were derived. Now that reference, and I'm questioning the reference from Mr. David's testimony was in reference to ORS, the workbooks provided in response to ORS discovery requests. Correct, Mr. David? Correct, Mr. Burgess?
Right. So the Guidehouse vid calculation workbook Excel files were provided in response to the supplemental response to ORS discovery. I think it was 1-4.
Correct, 1-4. And you identified it is possible that Mr. David meant to refer to another set of work papers that actually include references to operating reserves, e.g. the Guidehouse Flexible Reserve Requirement Workbooks. And it's true, isn't it, that that DESC had provided those a different set of work papers in response to SECIBA discovery, correct?
Well, the ones here, that I mentioned, the Guidehouse Flexibility Reserves Requirement Workbooks, those are also from the ORS discovery. And, you know, those ones were provided together with the earlier ones I referenced. So I was thinking that maybe it was, you know, the other workbooks that were provided in that ORS response. I was not, in drafting this, I was not thinking at all about the one that he actually referenced in the correction. So, you know, that was just, I thought maybe he was thinking of ORS and it was just the wrong kind of file name was referenced.
So that at the time you wrote this rebuttal testimony, you had all of those workbooks available to you, correct?
Yeah, but the context here really matters, and you know, which ones are provided in which context, and you know, we're still learning about what some of these workbooks actually are, because they haven't been very well explained, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, you make an excellent point, Mr. Burgess, that the workbooks are important and the information is important. Let me ask this. Have you ever been employed or have you ever run production models yourself?
Production cost modeling?
Yeah.
I've participated in efforts with my firm to conduct production cost modeling, yes.
But you haven't been the senior person literally modeling a utilities system to run production cost modeling, have you?
I guess it depends on what you mean by that. I've been in the deeply involved in the technical details of preparing, you know, the inputs and reviewing the outputs of them. I may not have been the person that clicked the button to run it, but you know, I would consider myself, you know, very deeply involved with those efforts.
Well, you may have been a data collector, but you were not the person that was responsible for the ultimate output of whatever modeling you were doing, were you?
No, I was the project manager on that.
And for which project was that? And for whom were you working?
Well, just as one example, we did this recently for an integrated resource planning project in Arizona, studying, you know, the IRP for actually 2 utilities there. That's just, you know, one example that comes to mind.
Well, let me ask this, but in this case, you haven't done any modeling, have you?
No, not in this case.
And let's talk about the other things that you haven't done. So,
Mr. Chairman, before Mr. Willoughby moves on, and I wanted to wait till he got to the end of those questions, there's an open mic somewhere, and I'm hearing some throat clearing and things, and I thought it was Mr. Willoughby, but it's not. If you could instruct folks to mute, that I'd appreciate it because it's interfering with with the witness's answers.
Understood. If you're not speaking, please make sure your mic is muted. All right. Please proceed or continue, Mr. Mr. Willoughby. Please continue.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Mr. Burns. I didn't know. I thought that was you tuning up to make an objection. So I appreciate you clearing that up.
Thank you.
So let's talk about the things, Mr. Burgess, that you didn't do in this case. You did not do a VIC study in this case, did you?
Did I do a VIC? No, I didn't do a VIC study, but in terms of doing any modeling work, I did do analysis on the VIC model data that Dominion had produced.
And so you basically looked at what Dominion Energy South Carolina has done and critiqued it, is basically what you've done, correct?
I would say, yeah, more than critique though. I mean, I did, I think, a pretty thorough analysis of the data based upon, the limited time that we had and the limited, resources that we had to look at this issue.
Attorney Willoughby,
Yes.
are you finished with the testimony that you were referencing earlier?
This I have for the time being. I'll be happy to take it down, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir.
Is that remove it from your screen?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Burgess, we're talking about the things that you did not do. You didn't do a VIC study. It's true that you don't have the capability or the knowledge or the expertise to do a VIC study as comprehensive as what Mr. David and Guidehouse did in this case. Isn't that correct?
I don't think I'd agree with that. I mean, if our firm were asked to do a VIC study, I think we could endeavor to do that.
Have you ever been asked to do a VIC study?
I'm not aware that our firm has been, but it doesn't mean we couldn't.
And so if your firm hasn't been asked to do one, that means you've never done one in the past, correct?
No.
But you think that you could, although you've never have, you think you could. But the point is you didn't do one in this case, correct?
Well, right. I mean, we weren't asked to do that in this case. And
well, why didn't you do one in this case? If you say you have the ability to do it, even though you've never done one before, why didn't you do one in this case rather than just critiquing and throwing rocks at what Mr. David has done? Why didn't you do your own and say, here's a competing independent study reflecting what we think the VIC happens to be?
Well, I think I was listening to the testimony yesterday, Mr. Sissi. I think he brought up a good point that, Dominion's really in a unique position to do these kinds of studies because they have, they have all the initial data. They've got the model licenses or Guidehouse, they, has one, but they can really, kind of get these going much more easily than other parties can. And so I think, ideally what would happen is that there'd be a collaborative process where, stakeholders could work with Dominion on the study and, provide more transparent inputs, review those through a stakeholder process. Rather than having dueling studies, let's find out a way we can, have a more transparent collaborative process on this. And I think that, and by the way, the critique that I gave, I would say, again, it's more than a critique. There's a lot of problems in the Guidehouse study that I identified in my testimony, and I sort of gave it, the benefit of the doubt and used the data, and did a thorough analysis of the data of the model to come up with an analysis that I think is more than just a critique, but it's a thorough analysis that is in some ways sort of an alternative study, if you will, because it's still relying upon the underlying modeling that Dominion did, but it's processing the information in a slightly different way. So, if you will, it's kind of like an alternative study.
Well, I mean, I appreciate you trying to retrieve yourself with that answer, Mr. Burgess. But I think the record is very clear that you haven't done a VIC study, have never done a VIC
Objection,
study.
argumentative, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I've got a question that I'm posing to him, and counsel will let me complete my question.
Understood, Attorney Willoughby. There's a fair amount of commentary that is going into your question, so I'm going to sustain the objection and ask you to ask your question and allow the witness to answer your question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Burgess, let's take a look at the study that see if I can are you able to observe my screen, Mr. Burgess?
Yes.
Do you recognize this as Mr. David's and Guidehouse's Exhibit 2 to Mr. David's direct testimony? And this is the corrected copy that was filed with the commission yesterday. Do you recognize this document?
Yes, it looks familiar.
So I'm going to direct your attention. This is on page 10 of the, page 10 of the study. And let me ask you if you agree with this. If actual solar generation is higher than forecast, the following may occur. Non-intermittent generators turn down. Excess generation is exported to a neighboring region, or as a last resort, absent another option to avoid a system emergency, solar generation is curtailed. Do you agree with those points?
Yeah, I agree with that.
And the reason you agree with that is, of course, the company we've discussed earlier, the solar put. The solar developer is entitled to put the power to Dominion Energy, and we have to buy it absent an emergency like has been set forth in this language, correct?
Right.
But then there's another side to the equation, and the other side to the equation is what the VIC focuses on. And that is, if actual solar generation is less than forecast, DESC must ramp up generation from reserves to maintain operations and meet load. You agree with that statement, don't you?
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out here that, there's a variety of different issues related to how Dominion has to respond to try to integrate solar onto its system. A lot of those were discussed, last week by Mr. Hanslick, but the VIC charge and the VIC study only pertain to a very narrow set of those issues. A lot of those costs, are already accounted for in other parts of the, avoided cost calculation. And so what the VIC's really trying to look at is a very narrow piece of the whole integration picture, which is unplanned, unforecasted drops in solar production, not the expected drops, not the curtailment issues for overgeneration, but only the unplanned, unforecasted drops in solar production.
And I think we've had many opportunities to discuss that, and I'm going to give you additional opportunity, Mr. Burgess, to discuss that. But my question was, do you agree with that DES must ramp up the generation from reserves to maintain operations and meet load? And I think you indicated that you agreed with that.
Yeah.
And then the next question that you anticipated was the issue becomes the amount of reserves required is determined by the total solar capacity on the system and the magnitude of a potential shortfall from forecasted solar generation. As solar generation is added onto the system, the magnitude of a potential shortfall increases, and thus DESC must procure and hold additional reserves above current requirements. Do you agree with that statement?
Yeah, and it's funny too, because this is actually not what Guidehouse analyzed, right? They actually looked at having a reserve level that's constant, throughout the entire month, not varying based on what the forecasted solar generation was, even though this is saying that the amount of reserves required should be based on, the forecasted solar generation. So it's just funny that this is, inconsistent with what Guidehouse actually did.
Well, I'm not sure it's inconsistent. I mean, you think it might be inconsistent, but let's talk about what you think to be an inconsistency. What you have indicated in response to Mr. Hansley, who's in the operations center every day, making sure that customers receive the power that they require, and taking generation from multiple sources, including your clients. He's the one that's having to operate the system. You heard his testimony where he has to operate the system minute by minute, correct?
That's right.
And you agree with that. He can't operate the system based upon a monthly average, can he?
No, I wouldn't say that.
You wouldn't recommend that he do that, even though you've recommended in your testimony that operating reserves should be developed based upon a monthly average versus the proposal that Mr. David made, correct?
No, actually, that's not what my testimony said at all. I did include a reference to a monthly average only as an illustration of the general patterns and trends of what's happening on that minute-to-minute look. But, I did look at the underlying minute-to-minute data to confirm that, that basically is true in most instances. And, and you say that approach of using a monthly value is different than Mr. David's, but that's also not true. Mr. David's analysis does use a monthly flat number for the reserve inputs. So, I mean, he didn't use a minute-to-minute look either. The production cost model uses an hourly analysis, but the reserve levels in that hourly analysis is held constant throughout the entire month. So, if anything, Mr. David's the one that's recommending a monthly average is the right way to look at it.
Okay, so I must admit, Mr. Burgess, I thought your lawyer had presented testimony from you that talked about a monthly average. You've got monthly averages in your testimony, but yet you say that the monthly average is not important. Is that what your testimony is?
Well, the monthly average can be indicative of what's going on the minute-to-minute basis. And that's the purpose of the table that I included in my testimony. So,
Go ahead.
so that's all that was trying to do is to say that the general pattern on the system as summarized by a monthly average, but you can confirm that by looking at the underlying data, that there's a pattern there that shows the reserve levels that Dominion normally holds are a lot higher than what would be required to integrate solar at the levels that the VIC study is suggesting.
But you do agree that Mr. Hanslick and the company has to operate the system and meet load minute by minute.
Yeah.
And you do agree that the intermittent nature of solar, where there can be significant unplanned drops, complicates Mr. Hanslick's operations in the operations center to meet that load.
Indeed, as I included in my testimony, my rebuttal, I do believe, yeah, there are new challenges associated with integrating solar as it's brought onto the system. There's challenges with any resource, integrating any resource onto the system, right? I mean, that's always been the case. I mean, even with baseload generation, coal or nuclear power plants that are also inflexible and, often operate as must run, which is similar to the must take from solar, and you have to have other resources to balance it out. And that's why we have things like, pumped hydro, and because those other resources run flat and consistent and can't really respond to fluctuations in real time.
Do I understand from that answer that you agree that integrating more and more megawatts of solar onto the system introduces more and more complexity to Mr. Hanslick and his operations and meeting the load on the company system?
Yeah, it presents new challenges, but that's, there's been a lot learned over the last, decade or so around, in this industry about how to do that efficiently and properly. And I would hope that, Dominion is learning from those best practices from the industry.
And I can absolutely assure you that they are learning very well. Do you see on your screen now, Mr. Burgess, the supplemental testimony that you provided this morning? Is that reflecting?
I still see the VIC study is being shown right now.
Okay, so let's see what I'm going to have to do is may come back to that VIC study because there's some things. Now let's see if I can share something different. Now, do you see your supplemental testimony that you just gave this morning?
Yes.
Okay. And that is your supplemental testimony, is it not?
Yes.
And let's talk right here, this Q&A.
Attorney Willoughby, could you enlarge that document for us, please?
Let's see if I can, Mr. Chairman.
In fact, let's, Attorney Willoughby, we probably can do a little bit more, but let's do this. This is a good time to take a morning break. We're in recess until 10:35.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the applicant is ready to proceed whenever the chair is asks us to do so.
Ready from here, Mr. Chairman.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're back in docket number 2021-88E. Let's take roll. Present in the hearing room, we have Commissioners Caston, Thomas, J. Williams, Powers, Belzer, and C. Williams. Joining us virtually, we have Commissioner Urban. Attorneys, I'm going to make a request from you all. Whenever you're referencing a document, please identify the document so the commissioners and anyone else who's following along can know exactly which document you're referencing. The document name, the page number, and the line, if any, would be very helpful. All right, Attorney Willoughby, if you would, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I would say that you're coming in very, very light. So are you able to hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Mr. Burgess, can you still hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you well. So when we broke, Mr. Burgess, I was sharing my screen. Let's see if I can get back to it. I'm getting so good at this, Mr. Burgess, that it's scary, my friend. So
Yes.
we're going to have to all stop and do a round of applause here. So, Mr. Chairman, to your point, can you see your supplemental testimony that you gave orally this morning, Mr. Burgess?
I can see it on the screen, yes.
And can you see it, Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
So, Mr. Chairman, you may not have this because Mr. Burns and Mr. Burgess reviewed this orally this morning, and as far as I know, they haven't filed anything and don't intend to. The record reflects Mr. Burgess's testimony.
We do not have it. You're correct.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, this was at Mr. Willoughby's request last night, and out of professional courtesy, I did provide a copy of the notes of the testimony that that the witness was going to deliver today, but this is not filed as a document with the commission.
And Mr. Burns, let me state for the record, we appreciate you sharing this with us. It was helpful to us to understand the points that Mr. Burgess wished to supplement. So, Mr. Burgess, let's talk about this Q and answer. Did you hear Mr. Hanslick talk about the fact that the operating reserves are being consistently updated in real time over the course of the day? And your answer was, yes, that's my understanding. And that probably doesn't come as any surprise to you, does it, Mr. Burgess?
No, it doesn't.
You would know, of course, that Mr. Hanslick is allowing all of us to address where the cost buckets are, as he said in his testimony. I don't know which bucket the cost goes into. I just know there's cost of maintaining these reserves. I know there's cost in the intermittent nature of solar that we have to address, the unexpected drops. So this statement from Mr. Hanslick is not a surprise to you, is it?
No, and in reference to the cost buckets, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the integration costs, things that were discussed by Mr. Hanslick, like dealing with the curtailment issues or, dealing with the evening ramping as solar comes offline, those costs would be reflected in, other buckets of the avoided costs, like the avoided energy costs. So, the integration charge that we're discussing, that I focused on, is really just that unforecasted drop in solar production on, a 15-minute interval.
And we focused on the same issue as what, more broadly than what you said, was the variable integration charge related directly to the integration of solar onto the network. And let's look at this question at the bottom of your page 3. And would this minute-by-minute view provide that should be a more meaningful picture of what his team has to deal with than a monthly average would provide? And your answer was yes, correct?
That's correct. And again, it's funny because the Guidehouse study does use a monthly average. So it's, not the minute-by-minute view that, would be more appropriate.
Well, I'm not sure you're exactly correct there, but let's stick with your testimony. And then the question is, does the need to analyze the system on a minute-by-minute view, such as what Mr. Hanslick provided yesterday in his charts, invalidate a monthly average view, such as what you provided in Table 1 of your direct testimony? Did I read that question correctly?
Yes.
And your answer, we're going to talk about the rest of the answer, but your answer to the question was no, correct?
Well, yes, but caveated by the following portion there, in that.
Certainly. And we're going to talk about that now. You state, I recall Mr. Hanslick criticized the monthly average tables I provided as meaningless from a system operator's perspective. Those are your words interpreting what you recall Mr. Hanslick saying, correct?
Correct.
And he's making reference to your Table 1 in your direct testimony, isn't he?
He is.
And then your next answer, your next response, I agree that those monthly values do not provide precise insight into what a system operator must deal with on a minute-by-minute basis, as reflected in the charts he provided yesterday. Did I read that correctly?
Yes, you did.
And then you continue, however, and the I refers to you, Mr. Burgess, used average values to summarize, and you italicize the word summarize, what was going on during each minute of the data provided over the course of an entire year. Did I read that correctly?
Yeah, and just to add a little context to that, so the table is, again, meant to be a summary, using the average values of what's going on in each minute, right? So it's not practical, as I say, to plot 500,000 data points in a table and really extract any meaningful information from it. So the averages in my table were really just meant to be an overview of the general trends that were occurring on that minute-to-minute look. Now, if you go under the hood and look at those minute-by-minute data points, you can see a similar thing going on, and it's going to vary, from minute to minute. There's going to be times when it's higher or lower than that average, but if you do take that closer look, the general trend is still reflected by those average values.
But you are the one that advocate using these monthly averages to make a determination of what operating reserves should be, were you not?
I don't believe I made a determination about what operating reserves should be. I was simply reporting on what they have been using the actual data that of, Dominion's operators provided, through discovery. So it wasn't a recommendation about, here's what reserves should be. It was simply saying, here's what they have been over the last, several years.
So your chart, your table 1, was not designed then to suggest that that's what they should be, but that's just designed to reflect what you say they have been.
Right. And the point being that what they have been is actually higher than what is needed or what Guidehouse says is needed. So to integrate, solar tranches 1, 2, and 3.
But how does that square, Mr. Burgess? And I want to hear your answer on this. With your statement here, however, I used average values to summarize, which you highlighted, what was going on during each minute of the data provided over the course of an entire period. I interpret that to mean that you used the average because you couldn't come up with these 500,000 data points. So you used an average to do what would have been better on a minute-by-minute view, which you admit is much more precise. But since you didn't want to do the 500,000 data points, you rather summarized it by using a monthly average. Isn't that a fair interpretation of what you were trying to propose?
Not exactly, because I actually did look at the underlying, 500,000 data points. That's what I was just saying, that, you look at those, I mean, that's the important data, but when you're, trying to succinctly explain what's going on in testimony, there needs to be a way to sort of zoom out and say, okay, what's the big picture here? You can look at any individual data point, and sort of see what's going on there, but how do we interpret this? And that's the purpose of using the average values to try to encapsulate more information in a succinct way. But the work papers are available, and anyone can go and look at the underlying data points and see what's going on in the way I did, and come to their own conclusions. But when I looked at that, I found that even when you kind of zoom in and look at those individual data points, it still tells a similar story as what the average shows.
So if we can look here, Mr. So you go on to say, so an average value was a good way to illustrate the basic concept. And that's what you did. And the basic concept that you were trying to illustrate was what operating reserves needed to be. Isn't that correct?
Again, I was reporting on what they have been. And in fact, as I stated earlier in this, if you scroll up,
you want me to scroll up to where?
Yeah, up to where it says, well, right there. That's good. Based on my review of Dominion's data in the 2020 to 2021 timeframe, with over 800 megawatts of solar on the system, there were 0 instances where operating reserves were less than 251 megawatts. And remember, that's the value that appeared on August 17th, that extreme day when the tropical storm hit, and there was a 251 megawatt drop. Basically, there was no data point I could identify in the last year where Dominion didn't have more than that in terms of operating reserves on a system in each minute each of the 500,000 minutes over that time period.
So, and so what you thought was then by just taking this average, and how many months did you look at, Mr. Burgess?
The data that was provided to me was over the last 5 years. So there was, I guess, how many months would that be? 12 times 5, so like 70 months, or maybe there was a little less than that because I don't think they had a full year for the last year, but it was over many, many months.
And did you hear the testimony that was presented? I don't recall whether it was Mr. Hanslick or someone else, where Dominion has experienced over the last 3 decades an event in each one of those decades that resulted in emergency procedures having to be put into effect due to lack of reserves and the inability to meet the then load. Do you remember that testimony?
I don't exactly recall that. Who was the witness that gave that testimony?
It may have been Mr. Hanslick, could have been Mr. David, could have been someone else. Have you listened to all of the testimony, Mr. Burgess?
I've tried to, yeah, but that particular detail doesn't ring a bell exactly.
Have you been doing other functions while this hearing has been going on, working on other projects?
I've been paying pretty close attention, but at times I've had to work on some other things, yes.
So you may have missed that, but if you'll accept subject to check that over the last 3 decades, Dominion Energy of South Carolina and its predecessor company has experienced in each one of those decades an event that required emergency procedures to put into effect, that probably wouldn't surprise you, would it?
No, and I mean, that's the reason why, Dominion has contingency reserves to plan for those events, that's something that is built into the way it operates the system.
And in fact, Dominion is the one that has the responsibility to ensure that the system is being operated and meeting the needs of customers at all time, correct?
That's correct.
Now, you criticize Mr. Hanslick when he talked
Mr.
about
Chairman?
the big.
Attorney
Mr.
Burns?
Willoughby, I wanted to wait till you got to the end of that series of questions, Mr. Willoughby. I just wanted to inform the chairman that we have sent this testimony, the Q&A draft that Mr. Willoughby is referring to was sent to Ms. Wheat to send on to the court reporter, and we've asked that she distribute that to the commissioners. And if Mr. Willoughby could just mark it as a cross-ex exhibit, then I think everybody could follow along with what he's referring to. We don't have any objection to him using this since that's how it was prepared, but I suggest that might be a pretty good solution so that we all are looking at the same document.
Okay.
I have no objections to doing that, Mr. Chairman. I hadn't planned on doing that, but you certainly don't have a problem with marking it, and it's already in the record, so we don't have a problem with doing it that way.
Just wanted to clarify that, just so that Mr. Burgess's testimony is that as recorded by the court reporter, and this document being referred to was provided to the court reporters to ease her ability to keep up, but also to Mr. Willoughby at his request. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So let me, Mr. Burgess, let me direct your attention to, you were criticizing Mr. Hanslick about the 48% drop. And you also heard Mr. Hanslick talk about drops of 75% 80%, did you not?
I think you mentioned those, but again, similar to the 48%, you'd have to look at over what time period. I don't know if there was a time when there was a 80% or drop over a 15-minute time period. So, you'd have to take that into account.
Did you look at all of his graphs?
I looked at them. I didn't necessarily do the same analysis on each one.
Did you look at the one for August the 17th?
Yes, I did.
And did you see the significant drops that occurred in very short time periods on August 17th?
Yeah, as I mentioned, it was about a 251 megawatt drop, and that was less than, less than the operating reserves that Dominion's had on its system over the last year.
Well, even the 48% drop that you mentioned, isn't the point there that at a 48% drop, it is greater than a 40% reserve margin that the company indicated that it routinely maintains?
Right. So the current practice, as I understand the company to use, is they build in a 40% level of operating reserves based on the forecasted solar generation.
And you've actually even criticized that, saying you're not sure whether that is the right level. You're thinking you might even suggest that it could be lower. Do I understand your testimony correctly in that regard?
Right. And remember, the 48% is over a 6-hour period. So you'd have to look to see what the drops were on, a 15-minute increment, and then what the sort of forecast was, which we didn't have, to see, how that lines up with what Dominion's operating practice is.
Well, let me make sure that the record is clear. Do you agree with the company? Well, let me strike that and let me ask it this way. You have criticized Mr. David and Guidehouse for estimating through its very detailed VIC analysis that the operating reserves in some hours may have to be as great as 60%. And you've criticized that, correct?
That's correct.
And you've indicated that part of your criticism is that you noted that the company has in the past maintained operating reserves at a 40% level. And you said, aha, that means that Mr. David's study is incorrect because his study has analyzed and determined that an operating reserve over a 10-year time horizon should be 60% to avoid that emergency event and not 40%. That's one of your criticisms, isn't it?
Yeah, and the reason being is because 40% is what Dominion uses, what the system operators have determined is appropriate. And basically what I understand is that Guidehouse is recommending a different operating practice. It's not clear to me that Dominion will move to that operating practice. And remember, like those integration costs based on that higher level, that's based on something that is not being implemented today. Dominion, Mr. Hanslick didn't seem to indicate that they were planning to necessarily move higher or confirm that. It didn't sound like he'd actually reviewed the VIC study in any great detail. So, maybe they will someday, but right now those costs at the level that, Mr. David is recommending, are not being incurred on Dominion's system.
But you do understand that the purpose of the VIC analysis, the VIC study, is to make a determination as to what the operating reserves should be in order to avoid that emergency event that could occur without those operating reserves. You understand that's one of its purposes and goals, do you not?
Well, that's not exactly how it was portrayed, but I guess that was revealed later in the rebuttal testimony.
Well, I mean, you have indicated that you think you could do a VIC study, although you've never done one. Would that be one of the things that you would be looking to establish in a VIC study if you conducted one?
A recommended level of operating reserves, is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that you could look at, you could do an analysis to try to determine what an appropriate level of operating reserves should be. And so the Guidehouse study has put forward a certain increase in operating reserves that it assumes would be required on the system. Now, I'll point out though that we still haven't really gotten to the bottom of how those reserve levels were determined, the sort of algorithm that was used to come up with those numbers. I'm thinking of, table 11 in Mr. David's study. We still don't fully understand how that was provided, and I'll point out that ORS witness Horry also agreed that it was unclear, how those reserve levels that they're recommending, were actually calculated.
Well, Mr. Burgess, is it possible that since you've never done a VIC study and that you just simply don't understand the analysis? Is that possible?
No, I don't think so. I mean, in all the work papers that we were provided, those formulas weren't included, right? And you look at the work papers provided to ORS 1-4, and those numbers are like hard coded in there, and there's no real indication about how they were developed. And so, without sort of seeing that underlying formula, I just have no way of knowing. They talk. Mr. David talks about it in general terms. He talks about the Monte Carlo simulation that they ran, but they haven't provided that model. Frankly, it's a little unclear to me, what in this context the purpose of doing that Monte Carlo simulation is. I mean, that's a useful tool in some contexts, but it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me in this context.
And in your work, do you routinely run Monte Carlo simulations?
It can be a useful tool in some instances, but not in all.
Well, have you ever run a Monte Carlo simulation?
Sure.
And how many times have you run them?
I don't recall exactly.
One time?
I've worked on a lot of different projects over my career. I don't have a number at my fingertips, but the basic point of it is that you're trying to look at certain probabilities within a large amount of data. It doesn't really make sense to me in this context because they looked at basically 1 year worth of data from NREL, the solar forecast and the production, and then generated these Monte Carlo draws from that data. But basically, you're just looking at one data set that, in my opinion, you wouldn't necessarily need to look at that Monte Carlo approach. You could just use the actual 1 year's worth of data directly. And if you were looking over many decades worth of data or something like that, that's when I think, maybe a Monte Carlo simulation might work. But in this case, it's basically, it sounds sophisticated, but it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense in this case, in my opinion.
You criticize you do agree with me that Monte Carlo simulations are a way of determining probability outcomes, correct?
That's correct.
And that they're widely used. Do you agree with that?
In certain contexts, yeah, they can be a useful tool and are widely used for that purpose.
But you don't widely use them because you don't really have a recollection of how often you used them. So you don't widely use them. You may have used them once, perhaps, but it's not something that's routinely in your repertoire of or portfolio of tools that you routinely rely upon, correct?
Oh, I would certainly use it if the situation called for it. But again, I don't think this situation does. I mean, you could have just calculated the forecast error directly from the data. You know, running the Monte Carlo simulation doesn't really add any meaningful information.
So let's say, let me ask this question. We've been talking about operating reserves, and you've criticized the study because the study determined that operating reserves need to be perhaps as high as 60% at certain limited hours during a 10-year time horizon. The company has been using 40%. What number do you suggest that the company maintain as operating reserves to address the intermittent nature of solar?
I don't necessarily have a specific recommendation on that. The company's been using 40%. That seems to have been sufficient to integrate over 800 megawatts of solar so far. Although I don't know that the 40%, what that's necessarily based on, I haven't seen any specific studies or analysis that the company's done to support that. It seems like maybe it's more of a rule of thumb, but I think that, that's something that now that there's some good history of solar on the system would be worth looking into and doing some more analysis of what, is there a more sort of precise value that we can come up with? And again, I think that some kind of a transparent study process to look at that might be worth doing.
But as you sit here today, your testimony is that you don't have a recommendation and frankly don't know what the operating reserve needs to be, correct?
Well, I know that the 40% appears to be sufficient for what's already on the system. And as I've pointed out, there's been a lot of excess reserves in the recent years. So it appears that, Dominion has some headroom to absorb additional solar at some point in time. If there's another 800 megawatts added to the system, I think that, you would maybe have to think about increasing that level. But I don't think that the analysis that Guidehouse done is a credible way to look at what that level should be.
So today you're not recommending that they increase are you recommending that they decrease the operating reserves?
No, I'm not recommending either. I think that that's something I think would be worth further analysis on, frankly.
You criticize Mr. David, and we're going to come to that till you've got some responses to Mr. David. You criticize the changes and not the corrections that he made. And you made one reference to him removing the reference to hourly weighting. What is your position as to what the correct method of making a determination should be? You've got in your testimony the monthly weighting, and we've just discussed that you said, I used average values to summarize what was going on during each minute of the data provided over the course of an entire year. An average value was a good way to illustrate the basic concept. You state that very boldly. You include a chart of a monthly average. What is your position as to what is the right way to determine the reserve requirement?
Sorry, the reference you had at the beginning was to the hourly weighting, right? And now you're talking about a different, so I'm just a little confused because it seems like there's two sets of data that are being conflated here.
Well,
yeah,
why don't
weighting-
you help on, you included the weighted, the average, monthly average information regarding the operating reserves. And you criticized Mr. David when he corrected his testimony, removing the reference to hourly weighting. What is your position on what the weighting should be?
Well, if you go back to that other portion of this document, I stated pretty clearly that I believe the hourly weighting is the correct approach. No, I think.
Well, why didn't you use the hourly weighting then rather than tossing out a monthly average to basically suggest that operating reserves were sufficient and the company didn't need to maintain any in order to meet the intermittent nature of solar? So that's your testimony, is it? That's how you come to the VIC being 0, correct?
So there's a few different pieces that are being conflated here. There's first the question of, is at this point in time, is there a need for additional operating reserves to integrate Tranche 1 solar? And based on my review of the data that was provided, it does not appear that that's true. And that was the basis for my recommendation of the $0 VIC. But if, we take the idea that there should be a VIC at face value, and giving sort of the benefit of the doubt to what Mr. David's study shows, then I believe in that situation, you should apply an hourly weighting. And that's actually what I did. I did apply an hourly weighting. You suggested in your question that I didn't, but I did apply an hourly weighting in that alternative VIC analysis. And that's the alternative recommendation that I put forward with a lower level of a VIC of 28 cents per megawatt hour.
So let's be equally clear, Mr. Burgess. If your recommended VIC of 0 were approved by the commission, the message that you would be communicating to Dominion Energy South Carolina is that they should eliminate all reserves. That 40% reserves that they're maintaining today should be eliminated, and they basically allow their firm customers to be naked without any reserves. That's what your recommendation would be, isn't it?
Not at all. No, that's not what I'm saying at all.
What are you saying?
What I'm saying is that the way that Dominion's already operating its system today, as it has over the last 5 years, even before solar was on the system, is sufficient to provide the operating reserves to integrate Tranche 1 of solar. So there's no incremental costs that are being incurred to bring on additional reserves.
And the study that Mr. David has done and Guidehouse has done, and the reserves that Dominion is maintaining at this point are not needed because solar's really made no impact on their operations. Is that basically your testimony?
No, the reserves are needed, but the point is that there's already a lot of reserves available, right? You're not changing your operating practices necessarily to increase reserves for solar. Because what happens is that Dominion has reserves for a variety of reasons on its system already that can be utilized for that purpose, right? There's already reserves it holds for other purposes, but there's sometimes just reserves available based on the most economic dispatch of the system, right? If you have, you know, fired up a, you know, combined cycle plant, but it's not operating at its maximum capacity, you have some headroom there, and you're not incurring any new costs to have that available. And so, you know, that can be used as a source of reserves for a variety of purposes, including solar, at essentially no additional cost.
Well, let's move forward a little bit. I'm showing on the screen now the testimony. You've got what conclusion, and you're now supplementing your testimony related to Mr. David. What conclusion is the new reference to SECIBA 2-14 said? I guess that means to support. Did I read that correctly, Mr. Burgess?
That's the question, yeah, to support.
And when you say SECIBA 2-14, you're making reference to a discovery request of SECIBA, correct?
That's correct.
And then you give an answer and you say, this shortage of reserves in a small number of hours is the underlying driver for the cost to integrate each tranche of solar, i.e., it underpins the fundamental basis for establishing a VIC charge at any level. Is that did I read that correctly?
That's my paraphrasing of what Mr. David is saying. He is saying that there, in his analysis, there's a small number of hours where there is a shortage of reserves and that's the fundamental reason why a VIC is needed, because you need to increase reserves to accommodate those small number of hours. However, when I look at his, at the spreadsheet 2-14, which I believe he may have been involved in preparing, there's errors in that spreadsheet. And when you correct for those errors, all of those shortages go away. There's no longer any hours where there's actually a reserve shortage that would cause one to believe that a VIC is needed.
Well, would it also be, you talk about correcting information in the spreadsheet, could it just as well be asserted that the changes you made to the spreadsheet were simply changes that you made in order to achieve a desired outcome and not really corrections? Isn't that exactly what you've done?
No, all I did was basically put the assumptions in line with Dominion's current operating practice.
And
For
then
example,
and then you
the
made
corrections
changes.
I made was, I was just saying that one of the changes I made was just to switch that reserve level for solar from 60%, which Mr. David had in there, to the 40% that they currently use. And when you do that, all of those shortages go away. There was other corrections I could have made, but I didn't get around to it. You know, looking at the pumped hydro and looking at the, you know, the fact that it didn't really include any geographic diversity for solar. Basically, the spreadsheet assumes that there would be a simultaneous 60% drop at every single solar facility on Dominion's system, which is completely unrealistic. So that would be another correction I would make if I'd had more time.
Well, let's be clear. You use the word correction, but you aren't talking about correcting a mistake. What you're talking about is correcting or changing. Use the word change. You've changed something because you want to get to a particular outcome that you have in mind. The data is not incorrect and the information is not incorrect. You've just taken Mr. David and Guidehouse's study and tried to make changes that gives an outcome that you want to see, correct?
No, I don't think that's true at all.
Well, I think that's what you've done. But let me ask this.
Objection, move to strike. Mr. Willoughby's opinion of what he's done is not relevant. It's a cross-examination. He can ask questions, not make his own testimony.
Sustained.
Mr. Burgess, you are aware, are you not, that the operating reserves that Dominion routinely maintain, that Mr. David and the Guidehouse study took that into consideration, and the study literally generated the expected operating reserves that would be needed over and above the 251 megawatts of operating reserves routinely needed. You understand that to be true, don't you?
Could you repeat that question?
Yes. Now, and do as I repeat the question, you know, the answer, I know you don't disagree with what Mr. David did. I know you've made changes to alter what Mr. David done to give your own results. But isn't it true when you read Mr. David's study that Mr. David and the study made allowances for operating reserves that are maintained to address issues other than solar and its intermittency and unexpected drops, correct?
So just to be clear, I'm understanding your question. Are you asking if the study included operating reserves for other purposes other than solar, like, for example, contingency?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, it did. My understanding is that there was an assumption that the one of the requirements that there needs to be reserves for is for other purposes, including generation contingency and some flexibility reserves for regulation. So that's about, I think, 250 megawatts was included as sort of the baseline for those purposes.
And once that baseline was established, the study reflects that, and I know you don't agree with this, I'm not asking your agreement, but your knowledge of the study reflects that additional operating reserves over and above that 251 megawatts was needed in order to address the intermittency of solar and the unpredictable drops that occur, correct?
Right. The study's claiming that there needs to be additional reserves over and above 250 when you get to the higher tranches of solar being incorporated.
And I recognize you disagree with that, but you recognize that the study made that determination, correct?
Well, I don't agree with the level of reserves that the study has identified. I agree that that's what the study is saying, yes.
Correct. So now let's look, you also criticized Mr. David in terms of, let's look at the very bottom of page 5. The spreadsheet produced in response to SECIBA 2-14 were originally downplayed, now those are your words, and Dess's rebuttal as just concerning illustrative examples. And when you refer to DESC's rebuttal, you're referring to Mr. David's rebuttal testimony indicating that SECIBA 2-14 was illustrative examples and were not actually used in his DIC calculations, correct?
Yeah, and this is why it was so concerning to me that the corrections were made, because in the original rebuttal testimony I reviewed, the references to SECIBA 2-14 or in some cases it was implicit, only seem to relate to the illustrative examples provided in Table 13 of Mr. David's study. So that kind of led me to believe that those spreadsheets, which again, were not very well explained, were only used to generate those illustrative examples. But when Mr. David made the correction, I had a different understanding of what those spreadsheets are and that they were more core to the analysis that he conducted. And so that's why, I thought that it was necessary to respond, because it basically changed my understanding of what these spreadsheets were. And it seemed like originally they were it was downplayed and saying, oh, it's just for these a few examples that we highlight in Table 13. But now it seems like this is more central to what the Guidehouse study is doing.
Well, do this. Please share with me then, based upon this new understanding that you have, tell me exactly what changes you would make to your testimony.
Well, some of that was shared in this document. There'd be other changes I would want to make, but there hasn't been time to do that yet.
Well, is there something in your we've got the supplemental testimony here. Is there something that your analysis that you've already tendered in your direct testimony and rebuttal testimony? Is there something that, based upon this edit that Mr. David did, that immediately changes fundamentally your testimony?
Well, right. I mean, for one, basically I think it strengthens my original testimony. It basically proves again that there's once you sort of change the, make the corrections in the workbook, there's no evidence that there's a need for incremental operating reserves. So another piece of evidence supporting, my conclusions and recommendations.
Well, keep in mind, he's changed the reference. He hasn't changed the workbooks. You've had the workbooks since July 20. So here we are on the 24th. So you've had them for more than a month to review them. You had them when you had to present your direct testimony. You had the workbooks when you did your rebuttal testimony. My question to you is there anything that you have testified to in that testimony that's been introduced into the record today that is inaccurate or incorrect or needs to be changed because of this correction that Mr. David did to the reference in his rebuttal testimony from ORS 1-2 to CEBA 2-4 workbooks?
Yeah, so the rebuttal that I had submitted, the main critique I had there in response to the reference was that the data he was describing in testimony didn't exist in the workbook. Now I can see, with the changed reference that there are some relevant data, but I would have a different critique of the because now I see what he meant to refer to in that in that context, there's a few different issues that I would want to respond to differently, having been able to see what data he actually meant to refer to.
And you've just indicated earlier that you believe that this reference actually strengthens your testimony. What additional comments do you want to make? I'm opening the floor for you to make them right now.
Well, for one thing, in this context, using that reference, it's highlighted to me how central this piece of information was to the analysis that Guidehouses had conducted, and relying upon it to identify the need for any incremental operating reserves, which is the basis of the VIC. But of course, when you look at the actual spreadsheet and make the corrections that I've talked about, you no longer see a need for incremental operating reserves. And that's central to the VIC being implemented in the first place, not just in a few illustrative cases.
So what you're saying, if I'm interpreting you correctly, is I can now go into the workbooks that I've had all along. It's the CEBA 2-14. I can go into that workbook and I can make my changes, and I can strengthen my argument that the operating reserves that Mr. David and the Guidehouse study indicates are needed are in fact not needed. Is that basically, if I interpreted what you just said correctly?
I think that's more or less, I think it's because it just, in the original rebuttal, it was confusing to me, since it seemed like this was just about the illustrative examples. And but now I have a clearer picture that this is more representative of the whole suite of analysis that Guidehouse has done.
And so where Mr. David indicates in his third rebuttal testimony that the CEBA 2-14 workbooks provide illustrative examples, you're disputing that. You're saying that I don't believe that's correct. I think that this information is near the core of Mr. David's analysis, correct?
Well, I think it's more, it appears to reflect more than just the illustrative examples based on the reference in that context. Now, everything, because we're still missing, some pieces of information about how the reserve margin requirements are calculated. But it does provide, I think, a more complete set of information than what I had originally perceived from the original rebuttal.
But you've had the information all along, correct?
We had that. I think that response again came in a few days after the original testimony deadline, and we had a couple of days to look at it before, opening testimony was due.
Well, Mr. Burgess, would you accept, subject to check, that it came in on or about July 20, and your testimony, your direct testimony, I don't think was due until July 27. So you had it for about a week beforehand. Is it possible you just didn't understand the information or didn't have the capability to review it and gain an appreciation of what the information was designed to show?
Well, well, first of all, that's not a whole lot of time. These kind of analyses, normally you'd have weeks or months to review. But we did address it. I did address it in my opening testimony to the extent that I could, and at that point in time, it was still sort of unclear what these workbooks were. They weren't well explained in the response that Dominion gave. Wasn't clear exactly, where they fit into the study, and so, and I still have some questions, really, frankly, about this spreadsheet and the information it contains. But I did the best I could with what we had at the time and the limited time we had to review it.
And so from the time you got it on July the 20th and the time you filed your direct testimony on July 27, if my date is correct, if you had questions, you could have generated additional questions to DSC, but you did not do that, did you?
I don't know if I would have necessarily had time to draft up those questions, to be honest, and I suppose we could have, but we wouldn't have had answers back in time for our testimony.
So like all of us, we're sitting here now in the middle of the hearing, and every one of us, every lawyer, every expert witness that have participated in this case has additional questions that they would like to ask. Even when I finish asking questions of you, Mr. Burgess, there'll be questions that I said I wish I'd asked.
Mr. Chairman, is there a question in this soliloquy?
Tell me, yeah, there is. Tell me what additional discovery you now need, now that we're in the middle of the hearing and you have been given an opportunity to get additional discovery. Tell me what additional discovery you need.
Oh, well, I mean, that's not an easy answer. I mean, there's things that would take me some time to fully consider, the questions that I would need answered and sort of draft those up in the right way.
Well, is there anything in your testimony that you've presented that is untruthful because of the corrections that have been made to Mr. David's testimony from the stand on Friday?
Yeah, as I just mentioned earlier, if you read my rebuttal, it has a critique that doesn't make sense anymore due to the correction, because I was referring to the fact that the spreadsheet Mr. David referenced didn't include data he said it did. Now it does include a different set of data that matches what the testimony says, but I have other critiques of that I wasn't able to generate at the time. So my testimony, my rebuttal testimony, would have been different if I had that correction in the first place.
And you've corrected that information in the supplemental testimony that you submitted this morning, have you not?
Partially.
And while you're sitting here from the witness stand today, you cannot think of one piece of additional information that you can think of today that you need in order to inform your judgment about the data that has been provided to you and that you've had, some of it from early July 10, 12, something like that, to some more in July 20 that you've had now for over a month, a month and a half. You can't think of an additional question today to provide elucidation about that data, correct?
Oh, I think there'd be plenty of questions to ask here, actually. I mean, just as one example, the Fairfield pump storage system, right? I mean, it's been indicated that was restricted during certain hours in terms of its operation. I'd like to know, what those restrictions were. When exactly did they happen? I'd like to understand why, if we could have a corrected version of it. Mr. David acknowledged there were errors in the spreadsheet himself, and I'd like to see a corrected version of that spreadsheet. I'd like to see,
Let me interrupt 1 second. Did Mr. David and his corrections indicate that that there was an error in his in any of the workbooks?
In his rebuttal testimony, he did acknowledge that there was an error.
And didn't he explain what the error was?
I mean, didn't explain how it was generated. He sort of said that it was not relevant, but
yeah.
It was an error, and I'd like to see that corrected.
So, so you want the workbook corrected, that error corrected. You want to know about Fairfield Pump Station. What else?
I mean, we could probably,
Mr. Chairman, I'd have to object to this line of questioning. This witness is not the attorney. I am. I'll come up with the additional discovery questions based on his advice. And if Mr. Willoughby would like to question me about the questions we think we'll ask, I'll be happy to be sworn in and testify. But this witness is not the person who will be conducting the discovery. He did list a number of things in his testimony that he would like to see, but he explicitly said in his testimony that he would have to look further and come up with additional questions based upon the fact that he hasn't had adequate time to review everything. And he now understands the reference to 214 is different than it was in the original testimony when he first reviewed it.
Mr. Chairman, if I may briefly respond,
Yes, go right ahead.
I think the record is very clear that Mr. David had very minor corrections to make to his testimony, and that this whole issue has not impacted Mr. Burgess at all. His testimony has been that, if anything, it's strengthened my testimony. There's nothing that he really wants to correct. They just want an opportunity to provide more testimony. They got started late, and they're still trying to play catch up, and that's exactly what's going on here. But I'm through with that line of questioning, and I can move to my next line of questioning.
May I respond briefly, because Mr. Willoughby has made an assertion there which needs correcting.
All right, you may respond, and then we'll move on. Go right ahead.
Thank you. Perhaps this could have been done earlier in the questioning, but the issue here is that the witness, Mr. David, changed his reference to how he used 214. If this case was about a building construction error, and the expert witness for one side said that he had provided two sets of blueprints, set one and set two, and he relied on set one, and then came in and changed his testimony at the last minute to say, well, actually, no, I relied on set two. That would be a fundamental change in his testimony. It may be simple and may be done in one sentence, but it's a fundamental change, and that's our position, and that's what Mr. Burgess has been trying to say as well. So I just wanted to correct that error. When you say that it's just a simple correction, you have to see it in context. That was the basis of our earlier motion, and we'd continue to maintain that, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. All
right, Attorney Willoughby, please move on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Burgess, I want to now talk with you about some legal principles that is guiding us all in this case. Are you able to see my screen now, Mr. Burgess?
yes, I am seeing it.
So on the left-hand side of it, and Mr. Chairman, are you able to see this adequately?
Yes, sir.
So on the left-hand side is a direct quote. Rather than quoting it, I've lined it up with bullets. It comes right out of 5841-20A. And on the right-hand side are quotes or references out of FERC Order 872. Are you familiar with FERC Order number 872, Mr. Burgess?
Generally, yeah.
And are you familiar with Act 62, which brings us all here together today?
Yeah.
Do you agree with me that the goal of this proceeding is that we are all searching, and the commission is going to have to find a set of rates, the avoided cost rates, and you're not testifying about avoided costs, correct?
Well, in the sense that integration costs are a piece of avoided cost, then I am, but not on the whole set of avoided costs.
Correct, but your focus has been on the variable integration charge, correct?
Right.
And where Mr. Neely has calculated avoided costs and put those into the record, you haven't commented on his calculations, correct?
I have not.
And you would agree with me that, and I think the commission, let's see if I can do this as well. The order does not come up, does it? So, all you see on the screen is, or do you see the order on the screen now?
I see a heading that says factual findings and legal conclusions.
And correct, and I refer you to the header here. It says order number 2020-244. Would you understand that this order was in the 2019 avoided cost proceeding?
Yeah, that looks like what it is to me. I don't know for certain if this is the original or revised order, but that's makes.
I will represent to you, Mr. Burgess, and I'm gonna give you a chance to take a victory lap because you're mentioned very prominently in this order. But this is the order on reconsideration.
Okay.
And I think the commission acknowledged exactly those legal principles where it says the commission remains mindful that in enacting Act number 62, the General Assembly made clear that any decision by the commission must be just and reasonable to the ratepayers of the electric utility in the public interest, consistent with PURPA and FERC's implementing regulations and orders, and non-discriminatory. Did I read that correctly?
Looks correct.
And then they go on when they start talking about the factual findings. The petitioners, which would be your clients in that proceeding, seek reconsideration of the $2.29 per megawatt hour interim value VIC EIC set in order number 2019-847, arguing this interim value was unsupported by the evidence and did not meet the statutory requirement that avoided cost rates fully and accurately reflect the utility's avoided costs. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And so the commission had initially set 229 based upon Mr. Ory's recommendation that was supported by Power Advisory. Do you understand that to be correct?
That sounds familiar, yes.
And then based upon the petition for reconsideration, the company is arguing, or your client's arguing, that the commission should adopt a different number, and one of the numbers that was proposed was a number that you had proposed in the case. And the commission says on its way through that analysis, says, therefore, the commission now finds that while the initially approved value of 2.29 cents per megawatt hour, DIC/EIC, is supported by the evidence of record, the alternative raised by other intervening parties is persuasive. Did I read that correctly?
You did.
And then it goes on to say CCL witness, FinClick, and SBA witness Burgess. And you were testifying for the Solar Business Alliance in that case, correct, Mr. Burgess?
That's correct.
Both recommended that the VIC/EIC be rejected. So you had in 2019 argued that the numbers being proposed, the VIC being proposed in that proceeding, should just outright be rejected and no VIC be set, correct?
That's what it says.
And in the alternative, as you've done here, because your recommendation in this case is it be set at 0. And then you've got an alternative, a little bit more, you say, but if you think you're gonna set a VIC, let's set that VIC at, let's take all of my changes, and let's set it at 28 cents and 71 cents. Tranche 1, 28 cents. Tranche 2, 71 cents. Do I have that correctly?
That sounds right to me.
But in 2019, in the alternative, SBA witness Burgess recommended an integration charge of 96 cents per megawatt hour. Did I read that correctly?
Yeah, and I want to be clear that the level of 96 cents, that was based on a different review I did at that time. And I wouldn't consider that to be inconsistent with what I've done in this case. In that case, it was a more limited set of corrections that I applied to the Navigant, now Guidehouse study that was done. And so I just wanted to make that point that even though the more limited analysis I did in that case showed 96 cents, I also suggested that it could have been lower than that if I had had more time and ability to conduct more analysis in that case.
Attorney Willoughby,
Yes.
I think now is a good time for us to take our lunch break. We'll pick back up with where you are now at 1:20.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.